With apologies to the country music fans among us, it's not really music I get into, and there's very few country music songs that I really know. I have to confess that I didn't even know who Patsy Cline was until I became the pastor of ERUCC. And it was a question, well, it was a statement by the search committee about how proud we were that she was married by one of our pastors. I'm glad they still called me because I must have had the strangest look on my face. But there is one country music song that I have remembered to this day. On one of my trips back from Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina, I caught a ride with a guy who got me as far north as Tyson's Corner. My mom will remember picking me up in Chambersburg, Tyson's Corner, however far north I could get. In those days, it was 9 hours of driving from Catawba to our home in Philadelphia, and it was about 6 hours to Tyson's Corner. Now, I tell you this because for 6 hours, I had the joy of listening to this guy singing, if you could call it singing, all manner of country music songs about women, beer, mountains, cars. I tried to appreciate how these songs were all about daily life. But there was one that must have been a top 40 in those years, and I've never forgotten it because I heard it 4 times in those 6 hours. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror. I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be one hell of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can. Now we laugh because we know people like that, don't we? Maybe even ourselves. But it's hard to be humble these days when we live in a society where we honor those who are brash and loud. It's hard to be humble when we admire people who make it to the top, even if that means they've trampled over people or climbed over top of them. It's really hard to live in a society and be humble when we're cheering for kids who score goal after goal in a game, even if it means they're not sharing the ball with others. It's hard to be humble when our kids must distinguish themselves from hundreds of other kids applying for a limited number of places at a college or university. It's hard to be humble when each of us wants to be seen as unique and distinct, but we've been taught not to brag. It's hard to be humble when we're teaching our kids all manner of perfection and they are dealing with anxiety in ways that you can't even imagine. For weeks, we've been hearing stories of Jesus' encounter with people who are finding it hard to be humble, people who find it just so difficult to acknowledge that there might be a different way of seeing things or doing things. For weeks, we've been seeing and hearing about how these religious leaders and those in power were questioning Jesus over and over again, trying to trip him up, trying to get him into trouble. They've been singing, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can" song because they believe they are just so right. So right. And Jesus has been challenging those comments, those gotcha questions from the crowd. He's challenged them with words and stories that he hoped might open up conversation, to get those in the crowd to see power in a new way. But today it feels like Jesus has just had enough. He observes that these leaders standing before him are so full of themselves. They're just so full of book knowledge of God, but don't know the love of God. Jesus describes their behavior. They don't practice what they preach. They take places of honor at the banquet. They show off. And rather than tell people about the love of God that we know and they know, they've placed people in these places where they carry these heavy burdens of having to follow rule after rule after rule. And Jesus says they refuse to share the burdens with the people, and all the time they're reminding everyone around them just how important they are. But before we get too excited about pointing fingers and praising ourselves for not being arrogant, do you remember Jesus had some words about pointing fingers? Remember his story about someone else's sin? That we need to be careful about pointing out the splinter in our neighbor's eye without looking at the log in our own? Or when people were getting ready to stone a woman because she had broken the rules, Jesus said, "Let you who are without sin cast the first stone." And no one threw a stone. They just walked away. Once again, Jesus is asking us to reflect on who we are and how we live in the faith. We know that one of the critiques of church as an institution from younger people, from LGBTQ folks and others, and one of the reasons why they have left the church community or they don't even want to try church is the observation that Christians say one thing and then do something else. Churches talk about open hearts and open doors, but in their experience, they find hard hearts and locked entrances. Jesus uses this moment to remind his followers about how to live as humble servant leaders or servant teachers. That there are other ways of doing things, of seeing things, and we're asked to reflect on what it means to live in light of the example of Christ himself. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Humility, having humility, is not a weakness. Demonstrating humility doesn't mean that you think little of yourself. Humility is knowing who you are, your own abilities and limits, and then not being afraid to acknowledge the strengths and gifts of the other. There's been a number of studies done recently around humility. I'm not quite sure how these psychologists measure it, but they have some tool to do this. But there was a study done at Eastern Kentucky University, and their findings were that people who practice humility tend to reflect inward. That's where they find some energy, and that humble people put others before them, but they do it in a manner that doesn't end up hurting themselves in the process. What happens is they have a real interest in other people and their contributions to the world. And this psychologist, this philosopher from University of Eastern Kentucky said, there is a lack of self-absorption, so humble people have the courage to try new things. So when they focus on others, there is less pressure to be perfect, so it frees them up to take risks. They're not paralyzed with a fear of failure because that's not their chief concern. They're conscientious. According to a 2012 study, humble people are more likely than prideful people to help a friend. Their moral compass guides their decision making. They go by their values when they're making choices. And it involves a certain respect in that decision-making process around these moral values like compassion. Humble people get caught up in projects and people and things they consider bigger than themselves and more important than themselves, and they get happiness as a byproduct of that experience. And here's something very interesting, and this was in the Washington Post in December, so it's got to be right, if it's in the Washington Post. There was an article, Leaders are more powerful when they are humble because they allow others to shine in their professional settings, giving credit where it is due, and they are open to collaboration. So they are more respected and they have more power because they share that power, and that power is multiplied. Humble people, humble leaders can have more power. And this is not describing what we might say meek and mild, where you have your downcast, oh, I'm so humble. It's not using that kind of voice. It's not apologizing for everything along the way. It's being secure in who you are enough to say, this is who God made me. And I'm not threatened to share those gifts of life with someone else. It really isn't hard to be humble, because when we look in the mirror, we ought to be reminded that we are beloved children of God. When we look in the mirror, we can ground ourselves in that knowledge of God who knows us and loves us as we are. It's not hard to be humble when we know we are surrounded by the living saints in this community and the community we call the church. And because we have those saints who have gone before us to guide us on our way, we don't have to be afraid of being humble. Look at the list of people whose names we are going to read today as we give thanks for their humbleness. For Ginny Clark, who showed such a love and devotion to creation and creating beauty wherever she went. To Betty Lou Castle, who no matter where she was, even in the throes of dementia, would have the most beautiful smile on her face that just made you just want to hug her and say, I am so glad I came to visit you today. Jackie Storm, whose life taught us how we could welcome unequivocally those who struggle with mental illness. And who in the world would ever say that the humble Bill Rhodes was not a man of strength, integrity, and authenticity? Friends, we gather today because we are surrounded by those saints who have gone before us. As we sang, we may be shining and we may be feebly walking through this world, but we have their love. We have the love of God. We have the light that shines through them, through God, and can shine through us. May we not be afraid to be humble, because God's helping us to do the best that we can. And let us share those gifts of love and life with all whom we meet. Thanks be to God. Amen.